If you're anything like myself, perhaps you're a bit uninformed of the inner workings and details of the countries of Africa. African generalization seems to be a thing. A lot of us seem to know and understand the different cultures and histories of the nations of Europe as an example, but so many of us simply blanket the 54 nations of the continent of Africa by describing them as just that, Africa. How many times have you heard someone say, I'm going to Africa, and not specify what nation they are going to? But maybe that's just me being an uninformed Englishman. But if you are like me, you may see the country of Liberia and think it's just another nation of Africa, and its name just derives from some ancient African origin. However, once you start to look into the country's history, you will realise, like all African nations, its fascinating history, which is perfectly reflected in its name. So perhaps for the seriously uninformed, like myself, what exactly even is a Liberia? Well, Liberia is an African nation in West Africa, bordered by Sierra Leone, Guinea, and the Ivory Coast / Cote d'Ivoire, with a population of over 4.5 million people. The cities of Liberia are considered to be some of the cleanest in all of Africa, and funnily enough, their current president, George Weah, was originally a professional football / soccer player and played for teams such as AC Milan, Manchester City, and even my team Chelsea. Well, they're sort of my team. When their president isn't a former football star, they are electing Africa's first female president. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was president of Liberia between 2006 and 2018. In more recent years, however, Liberia has had issues, from Ebola outbreaks to coups. But what about that name, Liberia? Well, it might seem the name has roots in an African language or deep African history, but this really isn't the case. Of course, the latter part of the name, Ia, is a common place name suffix. So what about the Liber part of their name? Well, the country wasn't named after the real name of famous comic book writer Stanley Liber. The Liber part of the name comes from the words liberty and liberation, referring to freedom, specifically the freedom of black slaves from the United States. The nation has very close ties to the USA, from the official language of Liberia being English too, and even their flags are slightly similar. Just a tad. Liberia was established in 1820 by the American Colonization Society, with the ACS being founded 4 years earlier in 1816 by Reverend Robert Finley. It was set up to help free the black slaves of the states to emigrate to Africa. Robert Finley's philosophy behind this was a mixture of reasons. He felt the freed black slaves of the states would only be able to reach their full potentials as humans back in Africa, the land of their fathers, as he put it. It was also due to the idea that he, and many others in the USA had at the time, that the freed blacks now in the States would affect the well-being and happiness of white Americans. Also, due to being a religious man, he thought that having people indoctrinated in Christianity being sent to Africa would help the spread of Christianity on the continent. As years went by, the ACS grew. The nephew of George Washington himself, Bushrod Washington, even became their president. I read that the motives of members varied. Some were genuine allies of freed black slaves and wanted to help them any way they can, and thought that their work would help eradicate slavery in the States. Other members of the ACS were simply a part of the society to keep slavery a thing, but just wanted to be able to remove freed blacks who they felt could rebel against the slave trade. Whether the ACS's intentions were good or bad can be your interpretation. I'm just trying to stick to the facts. Eventually, the ACS worked to establish a colony for freed black slaves on the west coast of Africa. This would of course be Liberia, named in honour of the fact that it would be a place of liberty and freedom for the aforementioned freed black slaves. The first slaves were relocated in 1822. When this happened, there was praise and criticism across many different locations and demographics in the States. A lot of Americans of African descent were not happy about being upheaved from their established homes in the States and being forced to Africa, while many slave-owning states were happy about the freed blacks in their states being moved. Either way, approximately 12,000 freed black slaves from the states were transported to Liberia, their new home, where they could be liberated from US rule. However, it was still just a colony of the USA. It wouldn't be until 1847 that the colony would be able to gain independence. This came about due to pressure on the USA put on by Britain to ease off control of the colony, leading to Liberia becoming Africa's first democratic republic, basing their constitution on the Constitution of the United States. With the country coming into existence as a place for freed slaves to lead a life of liberation, and then for the country to gain its own liberty and to become the first democratic republic in Africa, it's easy easy to see just why the name Liberia reflects the Ivory Coast, or its official French name of Côte d'Ivoire, doesn't come from the same reasoning as the also French Côte d'Azur. It's not because the country has an ivory colouring to it. This name comes from the fact that this part of the world was a large export of ivory. This ivory trade in the nation was set up by the French, who established a trading post in the land in 1830. From then all the way up until 1960, the country was under French control. This explains to us why its official name in French is Côte d'Ivoire, and why the official language of the country is French. Before this name was agreed upon, however, other names were used in the country too. Names like Côte de Dent, which means the Teeth Coast, and Côte de Défense, which means the Tusk Coast, were used too, of course both relating to the ivory. When the French first settled in the land, it's believed there would have been an abundance of elephants in the region, along with other large mammals too, like rhinoceroses. However, between then and now, it seems those numbers have diminished greatly, with a 2011 article stating that there were only 200 to 300 elephants left in the country. In just 1980, it was 10 times this, but in just shy of 40 years, the numbers of elephants have been driven down due to poaching and deforestation. There was a mass fall in population between 1900 and 1910, when ivory prices quadrupled. Ivory has always been a precious commodity, used to be made into an assortment of things from jewelry, trinkets, and even piano keys. With its beautiful natural colouring and what skilled craftsmen can make it into, it's easy to see why this material was so prized. Unfortunately, obtaining ivory means the killing of elephants. Not only are elephants magnificent animals, they play a hugely important role in their ecosystem. In dry seasons, they use their tusks to dig for water, not only obtaining water for themselves but other small animals too. And when they eat in the forest, the gaps in vegetation they create allow new plants to grow and allow small animals through. Even their poop is important. From what they eat, their dung contains many seeds, allowing more vegetation to grow. Killing elephants not only kills the elephants, but kills other forms of life that depend on them too. And of course, elephants are an animal beloved by many. People come to Africa from across the globe to see them in their natural habitat. Elephants can bring money to a nation just as a sight to see, not just for their tusks to be sold. Luckily, ivory trade in the Ivory Coast has gone down significantly. In 1989, a ban on international ivory trade was established, and elephant hunting has been just a small fraction of the country's economy for over a century. However, visiting the nation, ivory trinkets can still be found in the nation's gift shops and stalls. I can understand why ivory would still have an appeal, especially for tourists. You're in the Ivory Coast, you're going to want some ivory, if you're that way inclined anyway. But like I said, poaching of elephants in the Ivory Coast has gone down drastically. So where is the ivory coming from? Well, in 2018, a haul of elephant tusks estimated to be worth $450,000 on the black market was seized in the Ivory Coast. It was reported that the ivory had come from across Africa, from Gabon, Nigeria, Mozambique, and even Uganda, due to be sent off to Vietnam. Despite the ivory not coming from the Ivory Coast, ivory is still finding its way into the nation. To me, this seems like something of a one step forward, two steps back kind of scenario. While it's great to know that elephants being poached in the Ivory Coast have gone down significantly, ivory is still being brought into the country, and elephant poaching is still an issue across a lot of Africa. This got me thinking, should the Ivory Coast change their name? I was thinking about this from both angles, and I can see both sides. The name the Ivory Coast can be seen as a bad thing, a remnant of its past, where its most known commodity was the tusks of dead elephants. There were other coast nations in West Africa, the Pepper, Gold, and Slave Coast, all two named after their biggest exports, which is just a tad unsettling in regards to the Slave Coast. But these names no longer appear on a modern map, so why should the Ivory Coast? But conversely, I can see Ivorians not wanting this name to change. It's the name they know and the name of the country they are proud of. As we've looked into in the past, changing the name of a country can be a huge hassle, and this is all just my thinking. As far as I'm aware, there are no actual talks of a name change happening in the country. Perhaps this name shouldn't be a reflection of the ivory trade that took place in the nation, but more a celebration of the animal that ivory is attached to. Elephants are clearly important to the nation, with one appearing on their coat of arms, and even their football team are nicknamed the Elephants. The name the Ivory Coast could be a celebration for the elephants that roam the country, and hopefully continue to live in the country for many years. Mistakes are so often seen as bad things, but should this really be the case? I mean, yes, a lot of things that were mistakes were not too great, but still, think of all the discoveries that were made by mistake. Microwaves, penicillin, Play-Doh, cornflakes, and superglue were all discovered by mistake. And of course, famously, Columbus mistaked the new world he found as Asia. I know I wouldn't be where I am now without the mistakes I made beforehand. We can learn from our mistakes. However, we aren't learning from our mistakes today, but more learning about a mistake. That mistake being the name of the island nation of Madagascar. If your knowledge of Madagascar comes solely from the series of films, then fear not, as I was in that same boat too before getting to work on this video. Those films depict Madagascar as an island of just wilderness and jungles and dancing animals. The island nation has a human population of 26.2 million, and the island is the 4th largest island on our planet at over 226,000 square miles. And of course, the island is home to amazing wildlife, from tiny reptiles to top predators, and of course, it's the only place in the world to find lemurs in their natural habitat. Despite being so big and so populated, it's actually only been settled by us humans in fairly recent history, some arguing that it was settled just 500 years ago, while others believed it was settled way before that. Because of this, there doesn't seem to be a native name for the island before it was discovered by the rest of the world, though some sources told me that possibly earlier natives did have names for specific parts of the island, though I couldn't find any of those specific names out there on the wider web. The native language of Madagascar, Malagasy, doesn't contain the letter C, which is a bit of an issue as there's a C tucked away in the name Madagascar. Because of this, the Malagasy name for Madagascar is Madagascar, with the C being replaced with a K, making it a name that was introduced by non-natives but then adapted into the native language. So how did a country that's language doesn't contain a C end up with a C in its name? There are a lot of theories about how the name Madagascar came to be. The one we are going to be looking into, however, relates back to the whole issue of Madagascar being named by mistake, and for this mistake we have to thank Marco Polo. When Marco Polo was sailing, he saw the island, and he didn't know this was a whole new island he was looking at, but instead he thought it was part of Somalia, specifically the port and capital of the country, Mogadishu. Because of this, the island was labelled with the same name as this city, Mogadishu, which eventually was corrupted into Madagascar. However, once this mistake was realised, the name had been cemented for the island. So how did this city end up with its name? There seems to be a few ideas, from it coming from the Arabic Muqaddas, meaning holy, to it meaning the seat of the Tsar, or abattoir for sheep. The city is also known as Hamar, so perhaps in another world the island of Madagascar could have ended up being called Hamar too. However, it's the name Madagascar that the island ended up being called by, cementing another mistake in the history books. The names of country are usually steeped in deep history, forming over long periods of time and changing. However, this isn't always the case. Some countries are named by just one singular person. What's even rarer is when one of these nation namers are still alive to this day. However, the country name we'll be looking at today was not only coined by just one person, but that one person is actually still alive. There's something I find so cool about this. Imagine being able to say, yeah, I named the country. I'm of course talking about the African nation of Namibia. However, it wasn't actually always called this. To start with, the land that makes up the modern nation of Namibia was very creatively called Southwest Africa. So yes, this isn't the most interesting name, but it does fit nicely with the name of its southerly neighbour, South Africa. And there is a reason why these names are so similar, and that's because they aren't names given to the land by natives from ancient roots, but were names thrust upon these lands by European settlers. In the case of South Africa, it was a mix of the English and Dutch settlers who came up with the name South Africa. We covered this in our own South Africa video. And in the case of Southwest Africa, it was the Germans who came up with that name. Namibia became a German colony under the watch of Otto von Bismarck in 1884. This would have been as part of the scramble for Africa. This was a period of history roughly from 1881 to 1914, in which many European countries claimed huge swaths of land on the continent. They did this for a variety of reasons, some because of the resources that lay untouched on the continent, some for the national pride of claiming land, and some simply to stop others from taking it. This was the case with German Southwest Africa. The Germans were concerned about how much land the British were taking, so claimed this part of Africa for themselves. Southwest Africa stayed under German rule until 1915. Germany lost control of the land due to the First World War, when the land was invaded by South Africa. This led to South Africa having control over Southwest Africa, and they carried on using that name, though obviously dropped the German part of it. And it stayed under the rule of South Africa until 1990, when in that year it was granted full independence and officially took on the name of Namibia. And while it was in 1990 that the name was changed, the name was present way before that. The UN were using it as early as the 1960s, and as mentioned, the name of Namibia was coined by a single person. Though, who was it? Well, that honour goes to Mbumbra Karina, a Namibian politician, academic and author. Born on the 6th of June 1932 in the town of Tsumeb, which would have been in Southwest Africa. He was actually born with the name Eric William Getzen, however changed it when he was older. He said on the matter, "I was given that name by missionaries when my rights as a baby were not recognised, but when I became politically conscious, I divorced that name and became known as Mbrumba." As a child, Mbrumba was rather quiet and kept himself to himself. He didn't speak much to anyone else and people actually thought he was deaf. While he went on to become an academic, he actually struggled with schooling to start with, having to repeat grades multiple times. He's talked about how pastors helped guide his life and education, especially Reverend Michael Scott, no relation, who was also an anti-apartheid activist and spoke to the UN on the issues people were facing in South Africa and Southwest Africa. It was thanks to this guidance that Mbrumba was able to get his educational life on track, and as his grades improved, he was allowed to study all over the world. He studied in the States for some time. However, between 1960 to 1962, he did a PhD in Indonesia, and funnily enough, it was in Indonesia where he got the ball rolling on finding a new name for his homeland. Somehow during his studies, he met with the president of Indonesia at the time, Sukarno. I'm not too sure how he managed this. Some sources I read say that he was in an audience with him, while other sources I read said that Sukarno invited Mbrumba to his house for tea. Either way, the two were together, and Sukarno asked Mbrumba what the name of his country was, and he responded with, of course, Southwest Africa. This led to Indonesian President Sukarno saying something that would have a lasting effect on the young Mbrumba. That's not a name, that is a geographical area. My son, slaves and dogs are named by their masters, free men name themselves. And after hearing these words, Mbrumba set off to find a unique name for his nation. However, this wasn't the only reason as to why he wanted a name for the country. It was around this time that South Africa were trying to make Southwest Africa just another province in their nation. Mbrumba thought that if he could coin a name for their nation that would give it its own identity, it would stop it from becoming just another part of South Africa. After thinking for some time, Mbrumba published an essay explaining how the country should be known as the Republic of the Namib, eventually disevolved into Namibia. The name became popular, the UN accepted and used it as mentioned, and it has stuck around ever since. Though where exactly did Mbrumba actually get this name from? Well, he didn't just pull it out of thin air. In fact, he named his country in a way many other countries have been named, after a geographical feature, with that geographical feature being none other than the Namib Desert, which makes up a huge area of the country of Namibia. Mbrumba clearly thought that this desert was unique enough to the country, and that the land should be named after it. The name Namib actually comes from Nama origins and simply means a vast place, which makes a ton of sense as well. Deserts tend to be vast places, and the Namib Desert is no exception. However, the craziest thing from all of this is that Mbrumba never actually visited the Namib Desert while campaigning to have his homelands named after it. In fact, for the longest time he didn't visit there. It was only in 2016, at the age of 83 years old, that Professor Mbrumba Korena visited the Namib Desert for the very first time in his life. And at the time of this video going live, he is 87 years old, and is quite possibly the only living person to have named a country.
Not all country names are created equal. Some have truly fascinating stories behind them, and we've covered many of them over the years, and others meanwhile are a tad more to the point. For every interesting country name, like Mexico being named after an ancient god, or Japan's name meaning the land of the rising sun, we have less inspired ones like Norway simply meaning the North Way, or South Africa as the country is on the southern tip of Africa. These kinds of names are pretty boring to say the least, and are pretty bad from an etymological perspective. What I find most annoying about these names is that they don't really reflect in any meaningful way the people, history or cultures of the land. In no way am I saying these poorly named countries are bad unto themselves, their names are kind of just a bit boring. But neither Norway nor South Africa, in my eyes, takes the title of the most boring or worst named country on our planet. For me personally, that reward instead goes to the Central African Republic. This is a country that doesn't get all that much attention on the world stage. Unsurprisingly, this country is a republic in Central Africa. It has a land area of over 240,000 miles squared and a population of just over 5.5 million people. The country is full to the brim with beautiful landscapes, housing part of the Congo rainforest, and has an abundance of incredible wildlife. This is a really interesting country, but its name conveys none of that excitement. I don't think I've ever spoken about this country in any meaningful way, and that's because of just how bland its name is. You don't need me to explain this one. But even though this is the case, I can still mine some precious content out of it. Trust me, there's nothing I can't stretch out into a 10-minute or so video. So instead of just explaining this country's name, we could instead look into why it has such a boring name, and quite possibly the worst name. People have been living in this part of the world for a huge amount of time, with there being evidence of human settlement here from as far back as 10,000 years ago. For context, the pyramids in Egypt, which are super old, were only built around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. Yet despite this land housing humans for so long, we don't really have any ancient names for the area. The earliest known of name we have for the location which makes up this modern country comes to us in just the early 20th century. It was during this period that the scramble for Africa was happening. It was a period of time when foreign powers were realizing that the land of the continent could benefit them for a variety of reasons, so carved up the content for themselves, all without the true consent of the people of Africa itself. It was a harsh, vicious time in human history and shaped so much of the modern continent of Africa. The land that became the Central African Republic fell under French rule during all of this. While the land was under French rule, they didn't call it the Central African Republic. Instead, they titled this land claim Ubanga Shari. This name derives from the name of two rivers that run through the land, the Ubangi River and the Shari River. This colony came into being in 1903, and France would rule the land for centuries. They would have a huge impact in the land, and to this day, French is still an official language, and many in the country still speak the tongue. The country only gained independence in the year 1960. It was along with this freedom that the country's name changed from Ubanga Shari to the one we know today, the Central African Republic. This is the name the country has had ever since, except for a brief stint in 1976 to 1979 where it was dubbed the Central African Empire. This is because their president at the time, Jean Bedel Bokassa, declared himself emperor. From the fact this empire only lasted 3 years, I'm sure you can all imagine it didn't end all that well. Suffice to say, Ubangi Shari is a far more exotic, interesting and unique sounding name for this country, as opposed to just the Central African Republic, especially for English speakers like myself. So why did they decide to ditch the name Ubangi Shari and go with Central African Republic? I personally imagine that this name change happened to rid the land of its colonial past. This is something we've seen with other nations too, and it's completely understandable. The Central Africans were their own free people now, and they wouldn't want to be known under a name placed on them by their former colonial rulers. This is just my own theory on the matter, but it's something we've seen in the past. While that's my theory on why the name changed, we have actual evidence as to why the name they landed on was the Central African Republic. Seemingly, this title change was the brainchild of one particular person, that being one Barthélemy Boganda, the first president of the freshly independent Central African Republic. He picked this name for this country as he was thinking big picture. He had a vision for not just his country but for many countries across the continent. This vision he dubbed the United States of Latin Africa. This was Boganda's concept for the nations of Africa which were all once ruled by European powers who speak a Romance language, with these tongues all coming from the ancient language of Latin, hence the name of this proposed union. The idea was to include 10 countries within this union, those being the Central African Republic of course, but also Angola, Burundi, Cameroon, Chad, the Democratic Republic of the Congo and the Republic of the Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon and Rwanda. All 10 of these countries were either colonized by France or Portugal, both Latin-speaking countries, so they all fit the bill for that proposed name. Boganda wanted to create this new United States because he genuinely believed that by joining together, they could have more power and sway, as well as a louder voice on the global stage. Part of this idea included a name he gave for his own country. He dubbed his country the Central African Republic as something of a show of solidarity and hopefully inspire others to follow suit. The name implies that the country is not a standalone nation, but instead part of a wider union with other countries. Perhaps he envisioned that other countries in this pack would have similar names, like Angola becoming the West African Republic and so on. Of course, the United States of Latin Africa never really came into being. The other countries just weren't on board with the concept. Yet despite this, Boganda kept that name for his country as a remnant of his vision for a huge part of Africa. If this did go to plan and all these countries became a single nation, then today the United States of Latin Africa would have a population of over 240 million people and easily be one of the largest countries on the planet. So while the name Central African Republic might seem incredibly boring and bland to us now, it was given to the land with some good intentions and a surprising amount of thought. This name would make all the sense in the world if those other countries who were supposed to be part of the United States of Latin Africa didn't back out. It's kind of like if you and all your mates agreed to go out on a Saturday night all in silly fancy dress and landed on being the Spice Girls. Yet when you go to the pub, all your friends are backed out and suddenly you're there alone dressed as Sporty Spice. That might sound like a really dumb analogy, but for anyone who's been to the pub on a Saturday night, you know it's a real possibility. Knowing this history, the name makes all the sense in the world, but without this context, the name in a vacuum comes off as incredibly boring and quite possibly the worst country name in my eyes. So maybe it's time we actually do something about it. The USLA isn't happening anytime soon, so maybe the Central African Republic should stop trying to make it a thing via their name. Maybe they should instead find a new, more unique name for their country and rid planet Earth from this dull title. Now, this is all hypothetical. As far as I can tell, there's no actual plan to change this country's name. This is just me mulling over things to pad out this video. Like I said, I need to hit that 10-minute mark. But if they did somehow decide to change its name, then what could they change it to? Well, thankfully, we as a species have come up with naming conventions for countries. We can use these conventions to create a new hypothetical name for the land. Pretty much every country's name comes with just one of 4 origins. They're either named after their location, named after a geographical feature in the land, named after a tribe or ethnic group of people from the land, or named after a noteworthy individual. Surely one of these conventions could give us a more unique name for this land, right? We can, however, immediately cross out the named after their location option. This is because the Central African Republic already has a name based on its location, and it's really boring. In fact, most of the more dull country names fit this convention. Honestly, we should scrap it entirely. Maybe I will when I finally become the king of names. As for naming the land after a geographic feature, we could go with the older name of Ubangi Shali, as that comes from the name of 2 rivers. But once again, this isn't perfect, as we've already ditched this name before. I doubt they would want to go back to it. We could use another feature, however. The country's tallest mountain is called Mount Ngawi. Just Ngawi unto itself could be a great name for this one. Then we have the idea of naming after a tribe or group of people. For this one, we could look into the largest ethnic group in the land, this being the Gabaya people. They make up around 1/3 of this incredibly diverse country. We could easily use their name as the name for the country, making something like Gabania or simply Gabaya land. This could create another issue, however, as the Gabaya people only represent 1/3 of the nation and not everyone. So that could upset people of other ethnic groups. We could instead look for an ethnic group from the land's past. Apparently, some of the area's earliest settlers were people who spoke Ubangian languages, meaning we could give the country the name Ubangia or something along those lines. Then we have that final option, naming the land after a specific person. For this one person in particular comes to mind, that being their former first president Barthélemy Boganda, the guy who gave them this dull name in the first place. He was instrumental in forming the country into what it is today, so is undoubtedly a worthy person to name the land after. We could simply go with the name Bogandia if we were to name it after him, though he is far from the only person of note from the Central African Republic. Looking into their history, I stumbled across someone named Elizabeth Domitian. She was Prime Minister here, and was actually the first female Prime Minister in any African country. That's a great claim to fame, and one worthy of naming a place after. Domitia has a great ring to it. Of course, these are all just my ideas. They could pick one or go with something else entirely, but as already mentioned, a name change for this land seemingly isn't on the cards. So despite the fact we all now know a lot of thought went into the naming of this country, it seems that for the foreseeable future, the Central African Republic will continue being, in my eyes, the country with the worst name.
Ancient Egypt, people communicated through pictures with meaning and everyone worshipped cats. And I'm definitely talking about ancient Egypt and not the internet. And while we all now know this land of pyramids, sphinx and hound-headed gods as Egypt, the civilization who lived on this land in the past didn't call it Egypt. During the Old Kingdom of Egypt, the country was simply called this, which is now pronounced as Kemet or Kermit, but it's believed that in ancient times it was pronounced Kumat, though what do I know about pronunciation? This name comes from the ancient Egyptian language, which eventually evolved into the Coptic language of Egypt until it was phased out by Arabic, which is the official language of the country today. This name of Kemet means the Black Land, the black in the Black Land referring to the rich soil found around the Nile River. However, this wasn't the only name for the land in the Old Kingdom. Another name for the country was this, pronounced Desert, meaning the Red Lands, in reference to the deserts that comprise a huge amount of Egypt. But of course, these names weren't spelt like I have just spelt them in the Latin alphabet. One of the things the ancient Egyptians are most famous for are of course their hieroglyphs, and the name KMT is the phonetic value that we have given to the land's name from its hieroglyphic spelling. Now, hieroglyphs are super interesting, but unfortunately I'm not quite literally the Rosetta Stone, so this won't be a complete history and understanding of hieroglyphs, though someone should make that video. They can be split into 2 main groups. Ideogram hieroglyphs are single symbols that represent a whole object or idea. In example, the glyph of a pair of legs is an ideogram that means movement. The name KMT, however, isn't a single ideogram but a collection of phonograms. These are glyphs that represent single consonant or a combination of consonants. While we have some glyphs that supposedly represent vowel sounds, it's believed that the Egyptians didn't write vowels, so that's why we aren't 100% sure on how KMT was pronounced. Like I said, I'm no Rosetta Stone. So Kemet in hieroglyphs is this, with this part being a glyph of crocodile scales, meaning black and being pronounced phonetically as the KM sound in English. The owl is also a phonogram for the M sound, and the bread loaf is a phonogram for the T sound. However, the circle with a cross in it represents a town with crossroads. Egyptians used this to represent the name for a town or city. Later, Egyptians called their country this, which means house of the Ka of Ptah. Ptah is one of the earliest gods of Egypt, and the actual name of Egypt comes from this name. It was the ancient Greeks' adaptation of this name as Aegyptus, which they use as the name of an Egyptian king. The huge difference between these names is due to the fact that it's thought the Greeks struggled with the pronunciation of the letter H at the start and end of the original Egyptian name, and it's from this Egyptian name to this Greek name to the English name that we know it as today. However, the name Egypt isn't even used in Egypt all that much. As I said earlier, the country's official language is now Arabic, and the Arabic name for the country is Misr. It's thought that this name comes from the ancient term Mizraim. It is believed the name Misr just means country, but it's also believed it could mean fortress in reference to Egypt's natural protective borders. Egypt has always been a country of mystery. The mystery of how the pyramids were built, the mystery of what the hieroglyphs meant, and while what the ancient Egyptians called Egypt may not be the biggest mystery the land has to offer, I think it's still pretty exciting. I think this video actually makes me the Brendan Fraser of YouTube now.
Tell you is some masked magician sort of stuff. Like, after I say this, you won't ever want to watch another video of mine again, or at least the country name videos anyway. You sure you want to carry on? Okay, well, here it goes. Every country is pretty much the same etymology. Well, sort of. Most countries are named in one of a few ways. If you've been watching my videos for some time now, you'll probably already have a good idea of this. From my time talking about nation names and from the work of others, it seems we have to put most country etymologies into 5 categories of origin. Most countries are either named after a tribe or ethnic group who live there. In example, France is named after the Franks, Russia is named after the Rus, and Turkey is named after the Turks. This is pretty darn popular, especially in Europe. Another usual naming convention of a nation is that they're named after just one specific person. Take the name America that comes from the name of the Italian explorer Amerigo Vespucci, or Simon Bolivar, the political figure whose role in South America was so important, the nation of Bolivia was named after him. And of course we have the Philippines, named after King Philip II of Spain. When not being named after either one person or lots of people, the lay of the land usually plays a role in the naming of a nation, such as the many nations named after rivers like Jordan, Paraguay, Moldova and Niger, just to name a few, and Montenegro meaning Black Mountain, as on the mountains the nation looks rather black. There's also the countries named in reference to their location, like Australia meaning the Southland, Norway meaning the Northway, and South Africa as it's in the south of Africa. And finally there's countries named after other parts of the world, like New Zealand being named after part of the Netherlands, and Venezuela being named after the Italian city of Venice. One of these 5 explanations covers pretty much every nation on our planet, but it doesn't always have to be the case. There are some nations with truly unique name origins. Take Pakistan, a name which is an acronym of the regions that make up the nation, or how Iceland was a name that was meant to deter people from visiting due to the cold connotation of the name. And of course we have Malta, believed to be named after their uniquely delicious honey that's produced in the land. There's really interesting unique nation etymologies out there, you've just got to find them, and the nation I'm talking about today may just have the most unique story I've come across for a country yet, and I'm of course talking about the nation of Senegal. Senegal resides in West Africa. In fact, it's as west as you can go on the continent, as it shares its westernmost border with the Atlantic Ocean. It has an estimated population of around 60 million people, and the nation itself is just under 200,000 square kilometers in size. While the official language is French due to their history in the land, the native language of Wolof is actually their lingua franca. The nation is also home to a huge variety of wildlife, 7 UNESCO heritage sites, the tallest statue in Africa, a pink lake, and on Sundays, shepherds take their sheep to the beaches to get them clean and to have fun. The national sport of Senegal is wrestling, though I don't think it's the spandex, mask and storyline kind of wrestling, unfortunately. The first thing I'm sure a lot of people notice about the nation is the shape of it. Along its western border, the nation seems to develop something of a mouth, making the whole nation look a little bit like Pac-Man. This indent in Senegal makes up the nation of the Gambia. The Gambia's borders are made up pretty much exclusively by the Gambia River that runs through it, hence the unique shape. Why the Gambia is its own nation and not just part of Senegal, however, we have covered in a previous video, so feel free to check that out. Anyway, this video isn't about the Gambia or its name. How did the name Senegal come about? Well, like I
implied, it has a pretty unique story. Well, kind of. It is unique, but it also fits into one of those 5 categories we kicked off this video with, as the name Senegal comes from a geographic feature. The name of Senegal comes from the Senegal River, but how that river got its name is the interesting unique part in all this. This name of the river, and in turn the name of the nation itself, is believed to mean our boat, and more specific to the kind the boat is canoe, so the name is often defined as meaning either our boat / our canoe. Like I said, this is pretty darn unique, not just because the name means canoe but specifically means our canoe. This must be the only nation whose name derives partially from a possessive determiner. How can you not think that's fascinating? Though how on earth did this nation end up being named after a boat belonging to multiple people? Well, this origin comes from something else we hear about happening pretty often across the world during our history. That is of course European interference. Many European nations had roles in this land. As mentioned, French is their official language to this day, and the nation only gained full independence from France in 1960. However, while France played the biggest role in the nation, the Dutch and British over the years seized land in the nation too. Its location on the west of Africa made it highly desirable, as not only was it close to get to and from Europe, but was the point in Africa that was closest to the New World, specifically Gorée Island, which belongs to Senegal. This became a vital island for the slave trade, an awful part of human history that the British, French and Dutch all played a role in. It's always worth remembering that while these awful things happened in the past and may feel like they no longer affect us, they so heavily shaped our modern world. It wasn't just the French, British and Dutch empires who claimed land in Senegal and used it for the slave trade. There was a fourth European power too, the Portuguese. It was the Portuguese who actually were the first Europeans to reach this land. While it wasn't the biggest of empires, the Portuguese empire was actually the first to get started out of all the great European empires and lasted longer than the rest, officially started in 1415 and only ceased to be in 1999. First to arrive and last to leave for sure. Of course, the most pivotal part of their empire was the colonization of Brazil, which was one of the largest nations to this day and still speak Portuguese. The Portuguese wanted land across the world, primarily for 2 reasons: to trade and to spread Catholicism. Their conquest of Africa saw them inhabit Cape Verde and set up trading posts in the mouth of the Senegal River. The Portuguese settlement of Africa took place in the 1440s, so somewhat early on in the empire's history. While the land would eventually come into the possession of the French, it was the Portuguese who got the ball rolling on the name Senegal and how it got named after canoes. While the Portuguese settled there in the 1440s, it wouldn't be until 1850 that the canoe etymology theory would be put forward. This idea was derived by French author and priest David Boilat. As I mentioned, while French is the official language, the native Wolof tongue is the lingua franca of the land. This language was there before Europeans rocked up, didn't get ousted while the nation was under the control of various nations, and is still strong to this day, which is pretty impressive considering the fates other languages met across the globe when Europeans settled there. And it's from the Portuguese misunderstanding of a Wolof phrase where David Boilat suggested the name Senegal may come from. Boilat suggested that Senegal was a Portuguese/European in general corruption of the Wolof phrase Sunugal, which means our pirogue. A pirogue is a kind of boat made from a single hollowed out log, and of course a canoe is a type of pirogue. So as well as the name translating to either mean our canoe/our boat, its more specific title could be seen as our pirogue. I guess canoe and boat are heard of more often though, as they are much more commonplace names and more well known than the specific name of a pirogue. Boilat even discussed the possible scenario which led to this phrase becoming the name of the river and land. Imagine a Portuguese trader sailing up the river, eventually coming across a group of natives in their pirogue. The Portuguese trader coming to the conclusion that their locals may have asked them what this place is called, and as the locals wouldn't have had a grasp on the Portuguese language, they presume the trader is asking what they are sailing on, to which they respond Sunugal, meaning our pirogue. The Portuguese trader presumed that the natives were telling him the name of the river, so he presumed that Sunugal was the name for the river, leading it to be corrupted into Senegal, with that name being applied to the river and eventually the land that surrounds it. It's kind of a far-fetched idea, but there is some logic to it. Sunugal sounds a lot like Senegal, and the situation presented by Boilat isn't too far out the realm of possibility. Besides, it wouldn't be the first place to have a name deriving from a mistake. Both Madagascar and Rio de Janeiro's names of mistake listed too, as we've discussed in older videos. However, there is a key reason as to why this etymological idea has gained so much traction and has somewhat become the definitive answer to how the nation got its name, and that's because of the image and sense this name gives off. Knowing that your nation's name translates into meaning our boat really evokes a sense of camaraderie. The idiom of we're all in the same boat is used by many people, and it means we're all in the same situation, but we're in it together. To the Senegalese, Senegal is their boat. It belongs to all of them. Whatever situation may arise, everyone in the nation is facing it together. It might might sound a little corny, but honestly I think it's a really charming idea, and having your nation's name double as a message of hope and solidarity is really cool. I understand why this etymology has stuck around. Though as cool as this etymology is, it is just one theory as to how the name came to be. There are other ideas. Explorer Alves Cadamosto was hired by the Portuguese to explore Africa. He is credited with being the first European to see the Cape Verde Islands, and he also explored mainland Africa too. What we also know about him is that he was referring to the river in Africa as Seniga in the 1460s, which is very close to when Boylet's idea was thought to originate from. It could be seen that the name Senegal was already applied to it, and this name is thought to possibly come from a group of people native to the north of the river, the Zeniga people. It's pretty clear to see how Zeniga may have become Seniga, and from that became Senegal. Wikipedia even floats the theory that it comes from the local Sila religion, and their top deity called Log Sien, plus the term Olgal meaning body of water. Perhaps the Senegal River is a holy place in this religion, and you can see how Rog Senegal could have become Senegal. And while these theories of the nation being named after a tribal people or a god may have a bit more weight to them, they haven't caught on like the Arkanu etymology has, which is completely fine with me. Even though this etymology doesn't fit into the 5 ideas of nation name origins we laid out at the start of this video, the Arboat etymology is way more fun and unique. Well, that's what I think anyway. Perhaps you're not in the same boat.
It's fairly common for countries to have similar names to one another. Think of Austria and Australia, or Slovenia and Slovakia. But there's some cases where countries have more or less the exact same name. We see this in the likes of North and South Korea, or Sudan and South Sudan. These nations, however, make themselves easier to identify through the use of cardinal directions. But perhaps the most confusing case of 2 countries having the same name goes to a pair found in Central Africa. These 2 countries are called Congo, or more specifically, the Republic of the Congo and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Yeah, there's literally a 1-word difference in their names, and both are often simply referred to as just Congo. This creates all kinds of confusion, and we have to ask ourselves, how did we end up with 2 countries called Congo? Despite the similarities in the names of these 2 countries, there's a fair few things that make them unique to one another. The Democratic Republic of the Congo is by and far the larger of the 2, being over 900,000 square miles in size, with a population of over 110 million people. The Republic of the Congo, meanwhile, has just over 6 million people, and is a mere 130,000 or so square miles big. This means that the Democratic Republic of the Congo is around 7 times bigger than the Republic of the Congo. Did I say those the right way around? Ugh, you know what? It can be hard talking about these 2 countries due to their similar names. Thankfully, they do also go by other names that make them a tad more unique. Most commonly, they're shortened to just their initials, with the Democratic Republic of the Congo being called the DRC, and the Republic of the Congo being called the ROC. They're often referred to by their capital cities too, with the DRC being called Congo Kinshasa, and the ROC being called Congo Brazzaville. And of course, the DRC was called Zaire for some time too. This was a whole thing, and we've covered it in an earlier video. For the rest of this video, however, I'm going to call them the DRC and ROC, as that's just the easiest and least confusing option. Though something of interest is the fact that both nations share a demonym. Regardless of if you come from the DRC or ROC, you are referred to as Congolese. But despite all these other names they can be referred to as, it is that title of Congo which is most deeply tied to them. You have to wonder if this is a case of one country copying another in regards to their name. Like, which one of these is the true Congo and who had that name first? Well, seemingly, neither of them did. The word Congo wasn't created as a name for a country, but instead has its ultimate origins as the name of a tribal people who have lived here for an incredibly long time. The Congo people, noticeably spelt with a K here. We aren't entirely sure as to why exactly they have this name, as it's a word that goes so far back into history that we've been unable to fully trace its true origins. Though thankfully we have theories. One idea is that it comes from the word Nkongo in their language, which means hunter, in relation to the lifestyle they led. While another theory is that it might mean mountain, in relation to the mountains which are prominent in this region of the world. What we know for sure, however, is that these Congo people eventually founded their own empire in the late 14th century country, which was dubbed the Kingdom of Congo, which was housed in parts of both modern-day Congo nations. And then this kingdom led to the naming of the key river that runs through it, the Congo River, Africa's second largest river and the deepest river in the world. This river is pivotal to life that lives across its banks, and its prominence led to these two nations being named after it. So, just to recap, the countries are named after the river was named after the kingdom, and the kingdom is named after the people. And for those wondering, it was most likely through all of this as to why Kong has become a go-to moniker for fictional gorillas, as these great apes do live in this area. And in a roundabout way, it led to the name of the dog toys called Kongs too, as a friend of the creator supposedly remarked that his dog toys look like an earplug for King Kong. So, very simply put, the two countries are named Congo down to the fact that the Congo River flows through both of them. That's all well and good, but it doesn't explain everything to us. There are multiple cases of one river flowing through many countries on our planet. The Danube alone goes through Germany, Austria, Slovakia, Hungary, Croatia, Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, Moldova, and Ukraine. But all these countries aren't called variations of the Republic of the Danube, are they? They get unique names due to the history that's played out in these countries, allowing them to be named after things like the people who live there or other geographic features. While the land that makes up the two modern Congo countries both have incredibly ancient and rich history behind them, with the earliest signs of human life in them dating hundreds of thousands of years ago, the modern countries of the DRC and ROC are actually fairly modern inventions, which resulted in their names not being all that unique and more or less being the same as one another. These countries and their modern borders are products of a time period known as the Scramble for Africa. This was a time in history from around the late 19th to early 20th century, which saw European powers carve up the continent of Africa into territories under their control, which gave them access to resources they were unable to easily obtain in the past. Africa came under huge European interest at this time for a multitude of reasons. From the Industrial Revolution, meaning humans in Europe needed more resources than ever to power their machines, to the simple fact that many of these countries by this time had lost land in other parts of the world. Britain and Spain, an example, had more or less lost all of their holdings in the New World, which were now their own countries. This culminated in Africa becoming Europe's new plaything, for lack of a better term, for them to extract use and power out of. This all resulted in the continent being carved into chunks and claimed as territories for European powers to have under their control, with little input from the people already living in the land. It was this scramble for Africa that set in motion the modern borders for a large majority of Africa's nations today. These borders were put in place with very little rhyme or reason, splitting up families and previous settlements into different territories. A prime example of this is with the aforementioned Kingdom of Congo. The scramble for Africa resulted in this kingdom's land being split between two different territories under the rule of two different foreign powers. One territory which housed the former kingdom went to the French and became known as French Congo or Middle Congo in 1882. It was this territory which would go on to become the ROC. The other part of the kingdom would fall into land under Belgian rule and be dubbed Belgian Congo in 1908. Belgian Congo actually has its origins a bit before the proper start of the scramble for Africa. It was originally dubbed the Congo Free State and not ruled directly by the nation, but rather by King Leopold II, who used it as his own personal playground to commit all kinds of atrocities. Seriously, this guy was the worst. But it was Belgian Congo which would eventually go on to become the DRC, some years down the line too. What this means is that in their earliest forms, these were not independent nations, but instead territories owned by European powers and plundered by them. And this kind of explains to us as to why they lack unique names. These weren't really seen as unique places in the eyes of those who ruled them. Rather, they were seen as just land which France and Belgium could use to profit off of and flaunt over other nations. France and Belgium didn't need to give them more unique names. They were named for efficient and bureaucratic reasons, seemingly. They were land masses which housed the Congo River, as well as making up the former Congo Kingdom, so the name Congo got applied to them, along with the demonym of the countries that ruled over them. The places remained under foreign rule for a majority of the 20th century, with France and Belgium relinquishing power to them in just 1960. This was for a variety of reasons yet again, from a change in sentiment to the depletion of resources in the aftermath of two world wars. Because they were no longer under French or Belgian rule, they could couldn't really be called French Congo and Belgian Congo anymore, so they needed new names. And the names they landed on were the Republic of the Congo and also the Republic of the Congo. Yeah, for the first few years of its existence, the DRC was also called the ROC, meaning both nations from 1960 until 1964 had the exact same name. Thankfully in 64 they added democratic to their name, which made things slightly less confusing. It wouldn't stay this way, however. As previously mentioned, the DRC was called Zaire for a long period of time. This was from 1971 all the way until 1997, when yours truly was a mere 3 years old. After being called Zaire for a few decades, it reverted back to being called the DRC like it is today. The ROC meanwhile didn't change its name and has been called that ever since 1960 seemingly. What this means is that the two countries having the same name is a relatively new thing, only re-emerging in the 90s. I imagine there are people watching this video who have lived the large chunk of their life with this country being called Zaire. I obviously am not one of them. I was probably still watching the Poddington Peas or whatever 3-year-olds got up to in the 90s. What's interesting is that you may think that when they gained independence from France and Belgium, they would have picked completely new names. But they didn't. They decided to both stick with that name of Congo. While it might lead to confusion for us today, it's understandable why they both made this choice. The term Congo in these lands has had deep importance here for centuries and predates the time they spent being bullied by European powers. It was used in the name of a kingdom which had power here way before Europe even started exploring the New World. And of course, it's the name for one of the most famous rivers in the world, which is housed here. And finally, it's the name of the indigenous people of this land, who have called it home for millennia. So despite the confusion it may cause, I don't imagine either of them giving up that name of Congo anytime soon.
Ethiopia is one of the largest and oldest independent countries in Africa, never to be colonized by another nation. Well, minus 5 years of occupation from Mussolini's Italy. It is also the second most populated country in Africa, and the most populated landlocked country in not just Africa, but the whole world. While this ancient country may now be known as Ethiopia, this wasn't always the case, as historically the country went by a different name, Abyssinia. So where did these two names come from, and why was the name changed from Abyssinia to Ethiopia? Like I said, Ethiopia is an incredibly ancient country, having its roots in 980 BCE with the Kingdom of Demut, so this isn't as clear to us, like how the country of Burma changed its name to Myanmar. The name Abyssinia too isn't as clear to us. It's thought to come from the Arabic Habasa, coming from the Amharic Habash and the Arabic Habash, which means mixed and a mixture respectively. So why is it thought that Abyssinia was named after a word for mixing? Or this is because the land of Abyssinia was the home to a mixture of people and races that lived on the land. Nevertheless, this Arabic word of Habasa was Latinized over time to Abyssinia. The name Ethiopia, however, is of Greek origin, coming from the Greek Ethiopia. Ethiopia is thought to come from the Greek Aethor, meaning I burn, and the Greek Ops, meaning face. This etymology references a burnt face, but why exactly? Well, this etymology is of Greek origin. It's not a native Ethiopian name, though Ethiopia's native name in Amharic is now a variation of it. To these Europeans, one of the most striking features of this land would have been the darker skin tone of the people who lived there. A lot of Europeans may have never seen people with darker skin, leading to them referring to these darker skinned people as having burnt faces, in turn naming the country after this. Without delving into whole other subject areas that would not only involve my personal opinions over fact, but would probably enrage the YouTube gods, I won't talk about the social issues that could arise from this name. Perhaps that can be a video for another time. So that's where the two names come from, but when exactly did the name change from Abyssinia to Ethiopia? Well, like I said earlier, there wasn't a clear-cut changing of names. It seems the names throughout history have been used interchangeably. One of the earliest times the name was changed from Abyssinia to Ethiopia was in the 4th century CE, when King Azana of the Kingdom of Aksum wanted to convert his kingdom to Christianity, feeling Ethiopia was a more Christian name for the country as opposed to Abyssinia. But the name Abyssinia would appear once again, though unofficially. The Ethiopian Empire lasted from 1270 to 1974. That's over 700 years. This empire Empire was also known as Abyssinia. Even today, some languages still use a variation of Abyssinia over a variation of Ethiopia as the name for the country.
You've spent an awful lot of time looking at maps and talking about countries. I felt that I had a pretty good understanding of the nations of our planet. Sure, I might not be able to name all of them in a row, but I thought I at least had a good understanding of most nations. So when I heard about the nation of Benin, my jaw dropped. I can confidently say I had literally no clue that this nation existed, so huge apologies to anyone watching from this nation or anyone who has close ties to this land. That's my mistake. Maybe you are somewhat like myself and have never heard of Benin too. Well, after digging into this nation's history, it seems to be one of immense interest, so allow me to shine a spotlight on this nation for you. First of all, where even is Benin? Well, this nation could be found in the west of Africa, nestled between the nations of Togo and Nigeria. This nation is just over 44,000 square miles in size, so pretty small, but has a population close to 12 million. As mentioned, this is a nation with really interesting history. However, in the darker corners of its history, this land seems to have been the epicenter of the transatlantic slave trade. It was from these lands where boats would leave Africa for the New World, and natives of the land were sold into slavery in the Americas. This nation is home to a stretch of road known as the Slave Route, which was the last piece of land many Africans walked across before being sent across the ocean. Today, this history is recognized with a memorial arch on this nation's coast where ships would have sailed out of, with this arch ominously being called the Door of No Return. This means that a lot of cultures and traditions from Benin have found themselves at home in parts of the New World, perhaps most noticeably voodoo, which is popular in places such as Haiti and Louisiana in the Americas. Voodoo, which is a corruption of its native name of Vondu, which is still called in Benin, seems to be immensely popular in the nation, with up to 17% of the population following it. Vondu even has official religious status in the nation. Vondu/voodoo is definitely something we should cover another time on this channel. It's way more than just the dolls and curses that is so often portrayed as being. Like most nations, of course, modern Benin faces many issues and challenges. However, one positive Benin likes to pride itself on is the fact that it is seen as having one of the most stable democracies in all of Africa. I was more than happy to learn all these interesting facts about this nation. However, what I was more excited about was discovering that this nation has not always been called Benin. That's right. Benin stands among the ranks of nations like Vietnam, Ethiopia, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and Eswatini as a nation that has changed its name. I genuinely thought I'd covered the majority of these name-changing nations, and then I found out that Benin had been sitting under my nose this entire time. I was shook. So, what name did this nation have in its former life then? Well, it was the name of Dahomey. This name of Dahomey isn't one from the nation's ancient past. In fact, the name change to Benin is only relatively recent, as we shall see. There will be many of you watching now who would have lived in a time when this nation was called Dahomey. Though despite being the country's official name up until fairly recently, we don't actually seem to know where this name comes from. Even its entry in the online etymology dictionary tells us it's of unknown origins. I mean, come on now, Etym Online, I love you guys and made a career from copying you, but why even have an entry for a word if you're just going to say its etymology is unknown? That's like your one job. Other sources for word origins prove to be just as fruitless too. There's a fun folk etymology for this name, however. The story claims that the name derives from a conversation between Dahomey's second king, Dakodondu, and another chieftain called Dan/Da. Supposedly, Dakodondu asked Dan for more land to expand his kingdom, and Dan responded by saying something along the lines of, "Should I open my belly and build you a house?" in a sarcastic manner. Dakodondu, angered by this, responded by killing Dan and began building his palace on this spot. This folk etymology then explains to us that this name of Dahomey comes from words meaning something along the lines of kingdom inside the chief's belly. As mentioned, it's a fun story, but most likely isn't true. In the past, this Dahomey went by a variety of names, including the likes of Dasomi, Dahom, and simply Fon. This last name we have a clearer understanding of its origins, as this name derives from the Fon people. The Fon are an ethnic group from this area of Africa, and to this day are still the largest ethnic group in the nation of Benin. Why they are called this, however, we don't seem to know. However, it's this alternative name that we had the most insight on when it comes to the etymology of Dahomey. This is a part of the planet that didn't keep track of its etymologies, it seems, and that's completely okay. It's always fascinating coming across a name which can't be explained. They serve as a gentle reminder of just how little we know about our world at times, and they also remind us that unlike dinosaur bones or Greek pottery, names and words can't survive the ravages of time as easily. While this name might be a mystery to us, we know a lot more about Dahomey's past. If you didn't realize from the fact that they once had a king, Dahomey started life as a kingdom. Before the establishment of this kingdom, various smaller tribes settled in this land. Eventually though, the Fon people rose to be the most powerful and established this kingdom in around 1600 AD. The definitive origins of this kingdom, however, like the name, aren't entirely known. There's a variety of founding myths for this kingdom, with the most popular being one of princes fighting over who should rule these lands, with eventually these three princes all going off to form their own kingdoms. Dahomey would remain an independent African nation until 1894. It was in this year that the kingdom was overtaken by the French. This of course didn't just happen overnight. The kingdom and this land had ties with Europe for some time, with there being evidence of Portuguese trade happening here before even the formation of this kingdom. French relations with Dahomey actually started back in 1878, as it was in this year that Benin's most economically prosperous city of Cotonou became a French protectorate. France wanted to rule this city as the trade in goods it produced was highly valuable to them. The king of Dahomey at this time, Galili, was friendly with the French. However, when he died in 1889, his son of Bihanzin took over and immediately became a lot more hostile towards the French. He retracted treaties with France and even raided them. This came to a breaking point in 1892 when war broke out between France and Dahomey. The French felt that the only way to regain control of the land was via a military takeover. This was achieved 2 years later in 1894 when the entire kingdom came under French rule, becoming known as French Dahomey. This land stayed under French rule all the way until 1958 when it became self-governing. Then 2 years later, on the 1st of August 1960, the nation became fully independent once again. Of course, with fresh independence came a name change. It had already gone from the Kingdom of Dahomey to French Dahomey, and its new name was the Republic of Dahomey. This probably wasn't the name change you were expecting. Normally, it's when countries gain independence they change their names, and while going from kingdom to French to republic is a big change unto itself, you'd have thought they would have changed the Dahomey part of the name too. However, the Republic of Dahomey would not gain the name Benin until 1975. That's 15 years after their initial independence. It was on the 30th of November 1975 to be exact that Dahomey changed its name to Benin. It was this year that the Republic of Dahomey became the People's Republic of Benin. This was in the aftermath of a socialist coup on the nation in 1972. The name change was meant to symbolize the socialism now in the nation. Perhaps these socialists wished to move away from the name Dahomey, as that was a name for a kingdom, something they no longer wanted to be linked to. This People's Republic became just the Republic of Benin in 1990, which it is to this day. But where did these socialists get the name of Benin from anyway? Well, funnily enough, Benin is a word that started its life as the name for a kingdom too, though not a kingdom within the borders of modern day Benin. The Kingdom of Benin, also known as the Edo Kingdom, lasted from 1180 to 1897 according to Wikipedia, and was on land that is now part of the nation of Nigeria, Benin's eastern neighbour. As to how this Nigerian kingdom got its name? Well, it was of course named after its resident, the Bini people. The name of the Bini people themselves is thought to possibly derive from the Arabic Bani, meaning sons, as they were the children of this area, I suppose. SM Online actually had my back on this one. Cheers guys. So why did the people people of Dahomey picked the name of a long-gone Nigerian kingdom to use as their new name. Well, that kingdom also led to something else being called Benin too, that being the Bight of Benin. Bights are not things we talk about all too often, and they appear in the names of places even less. A bight, however, is a geographical feature, being the name for bends or curvatures in a coastline. The Bight of Benin can be found within the Gulf of Guinea in the southern shores of West Africa. This bight, like Benin itself, became heavily linked with the slave trade. It even appeared in shanties and rhymes with lines like, "Beware, beware the Bight of Benin, for few come out though many go in." It says in, but I'm making it rhyme with Benin here because that just makes more sense. Anyway, this is thought to be a reference to malaria, as many would catch the disease as they plundered the lands. Of course, the Kingdom of Benin made its home on this bight, hence why it was named after them. This bight, however, stretches from modern-day Nigeria, where the Kingdom of Benin was, over into the nation that was formerly called Dahomey, now of course named after this bight. So the nation of Benin got its name from the Bight of Benin, as the nation is on this bight. Then the Bight of Benin got its name from the long-gone Kingdom of Benin, which wasn't actually in Benin but in Nigeria, and this Kingdom of Benin was named after the Bini people. So just to be clear, that's people, kingdom, bight, nation. Maybe it would have been less confusing if they just stuck with that name of Dahomey. Though without this name change, I wouldn't have found out all about Benin, and maybe you wouldn't have either. Though some other YouTubers probably talked about it already. I don't check these things.
While the world may currently be watching another country go through a name change, it was last year in 2018 when we saw another nation change its name. I should have covered this when it was relevant, but being topical has never been my strongest point. This was of course when in April of 2018, it was announced that the nation of Swaziland would change its name to Eswatini. Eswatini is a relatively small landlocked nation nestled between Mozambique and South Africa. Despite being so small, it has vast mountains running across its eastern edge. So wait a minute, landlocked, small and mountainous? It's easy to see why people get the names of Swaziland and Switzerland mixed up, more on that later. Starting in 1906, Swaziland, as it was called at that time, was ruled over by the British as one of their colonies. However, this wasn't forever, as in 1968, Swaziland became an independent nation once again. In fact, the name change coincided with 50 years of independence from the British. But what about that name? Well, the initial name of Swaziland anyway. If you're a long-time viewer, and if you aren't, then don't forget to subscribe, I'm sure you have a fair idea as to what this name means. We see the land suffix in country names so often, and the previous part of these names usually tell us who that land belongs to. In this case, it is of course the Swazi people, also known as the Swati, with Swaziland meaning the land of the Swazi. So where exactly did the name of these people come from? Well, luckily we actually have a clear answer to this for once. The name comes from the name of one of their former kings, King Mswati II, who reigned from 1840 to 1868. Mswati II is considered to be one of the greatest kings in African history, claiming more land for Swaziland than anyone else, even land they have since lost. It was the name of this great king that his followers and the nation became named after. Yet that was Mswati II. Fast forward 150 years to 2018 and we have the current king of Eswatini, Mswati III. Mswati III took over the throne at just 18 years old and hasn't built quite the same reputation as Mswati II. His luxurious and polygamous lifestyle has left many of his subjects not too happy to call him their king. Nevertheless, it was in 2018 he announced that the country would now be called Eswatini as opposed to Swaziland. This name change happened for a couple reasons. One, as we mentioned earlier, he was getting annoyed about the Swaziland-Switzerland mix-up, and secondly, he was not happy that the former name of Swaziland was a mixture of Swazi and English. Many African nations took their former native names after colonial rule in them had ended. King Mswati wished for this remnant of colonial rule to be gone, and now it is. Luckily, however, we don't need to look too deeply into this name, as this name too means exactly what Swaziland meant too, the land of the Swazi. Yet, how was he able to change the name of the country so easily? As we are witnessing now with Greece and Macedonia, big changes to a country like this aren't usually so easy to push through. Also, this Portuguese coverage of the whole Greece-Macedonia situation actually used my video to help explain the situation. They didn't credit me or ask my permission. It's cool but kind of weird and anyway, the reason the king could so easily change this is due to the fact that Eswatini is Africa's last absolute monarchy, which means that he and he alone has more or less complete control over anything in the nation. If he wants to change the name, he simply can, without having to seek approval from any government bodies or his subjects. Of course, however, while he may have been able to change the nation's name easily, that doesn't mean that actually doing so will be as easy. It's safe to say there's a lot to get done when having to change a country's name. Think of all the places that name will be changed. The currency, airlines, well, they're one airplane, signs at borders, literally everywhere the name is written will need to be changed. Luckily, however, the name Swaziland doesn't appear in their national anthem, so that's one thing they can. There are many countries with directions in their names, yet most of these come from the fact that they were once one large country that split up. South Korea and North Korea were once just the country of Korea. South Sudan was once part of Sudan, and historically we had East and West Germany, which has since reformed to recreate Germany. There's only two nations, however, that have directions in their names that don't exist from bigger nations splitting up, but just come from their location on the continent they are in, and both reside on the continent of Africa, these being the Central African Republic, and of course the country in the title of this video, South Africa. Now, South Africa probably has the simplest name explained of all the countries. It's in the south of Africa. There you go guys, thanks for watching, don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Bye. Okay, maybe there's more to it than that. I mean, why hasn't it got a more unique name as opposed to just being named after where it is? Spain isn't called South Europe and Canada isn't called North America. It's an odd blip on the radar of names that I want to explore. In a more literal sense, we could explain South Africa's name by breaking down the etymologies of the two words that make up South Africa's name, South and Africa. South comes from the Proto-Germanic Sunfaz, and the name Africa comes from either one of the native tribes named the Afri or the Phoenician word for dust, Afar. But of course, this video isn't about literally what South and Africa mean, but why those two words have been brought together to name a country. So, South Africa's full official English name is the Republic of South Africa. I say English official name as South Africa has 11 official languages including English, with every other official language of South Africa having the name Republic of South Africa in their own tongue. But before it became a republic, it was called the Union of South Africa. So how did the Union of South Africa come into existence? The Union came into existence in 1910. By the turn of the century, the indigenous people had lost a lot of their political and economic independence thanks to harsh taxes and reduced wages imposed by the British authorities, as well as the British bringing in Chinese workers to work in the booming mining business happening in the south of Africa at the time, undercutting a lot of native people. It's safe to say that tensions, especially racial, between the British and natives were high. Peace had only come about a few years ago with the Treaty of Vereeniging, which had also ended the Second Anglo-Boer War, which had taken over the land. Yet the British and Afrikaners, the descendants of the original Dutch settlers in Africa, put aside their differences in the 1910 Act of Union, at the expense of the black South Africans, to secure power to the whites by bringing together the British colonies of Cape, Natal, Orange River and Transvaal. These colonies made up the lands of the Union of South Africa and eventually the modern day Republic of South Africa, when then Prime Minister Hendrik Verwoerd got a white only referendum through to turn South Africa into a republic in 1961. The country of South Africa has always had a volatile history with big racial divisions, which were even present in the country's etymology. And as I mentioned earlier, South Africa isn't the only country named after its geographical location. The Central African Republic has this feature too and shares something of a similar history, the land originally being ruled by France as a colony until gaining independence and becoming a republic in 1960, 1 year before South Africa. But going back to the Union of South Africa, and more specifically the colonies that existed to form it, how did these colonies get their names? Well, the Orange River Colony, which eventually became the Orange Free State Province, is named after the Orange River in South Africa. The Cape Colony is named after the Cape of Good Hope. The Natal Colony comes from the name of the region of Southern Africa it was in, Natal, this name coming from the Portuguese word for Christmas, as it was discovered by Portuguese sailor Vasco da Gama, who reached the land on Christmas Day. The Transvaal Colony comes from the combination of the prefix of trans, meaning across/beyond, and the Vaal River, as the colony was north and beyond the Vaal River. Yet there are other proposed names for South Africa that don't originate from its position on the continent. The name Azania has no clear origin. Some believe that it comes from a derivation of the land of Zan, or Zeus, while others believe it has the same root of Zanzibar, meaning black, just to name a few ideas. It's a name, however, some believe that the country should use, as its current name of South Africa is a relic of its British colonial past. Umzansi is another colloquial name for South Africa, coming from the word south in the Xhosa language, Umzansi. Sorry guys, I cannot do the tongue click to save my life. You can hear Corsica pronounced correctly down below. While most countries with directions in their names came from a previous bigger country splitting into two smaller countries, South Africa is quite the opposite. While of course these were colonies, not countries, the smaller colonies merged together to form a larger country, and all these colonies were in the south of the continent of Africa, so it only made sense to call them all collectively the Union of South Africa, which led to the modern name for the country that we all know today.